Hi everyone, my name's Iona and I'm going to be moderating the webinar today. I want to say a massive welcome to everybody, first of all. This event, Challenging Perpetrator Behaviour, is part of 16 days of action to end gender-based violence. Kent Integrated Domestic Abuse Service are hosting 16 events, culminating this Thursday to inform, educate and inspire action so that we can make domestic abuse everybody's business. Because domestic abuse is everybody's business and everyone can make a difference, which is what you're doing by attending today. So thank you. During the event, you're going to be able to use the Q&A function on your screen to ask Luke questions. As moderator, I'm going to be publishing these throughout the event and I'll ask them at the end of the session. You can use the thumbs up underneath a question to upvote it if that's something you'd like to ask as well. And if you'd like to ask a follow-up question, use the words follow-up to preface that question, and I will do my very best to link them together. Luke's going to be speaking for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. And I want to note that your email confirmations show that the webinars are going to be slightly longer. So that's just so we don't get cut off by the system. My last bit of housekeeping is to let you know that the new and improved Kent Domestic Abuse website has popped up on your screen. You can use this to find out about your local services. If you don't want to be seeing that right now, you can click the little X on the corner of the pop-up and we'll pop it up again at the end of the session. So that just leaves me with the wonderful job of introducing Luke Kendall. Luke is a practice advisor working on the Drive project, a respect, safe lives and social finance collaboration for high risk or high harm perpetrators of domestic abuse. As an accredited trainer and assessor, Luke also authors and delivers psychoeducational, domestic abuse and sexual abuse programs as an associate trainer for both Safe Lives and Rockpool. Luke began life in the sector as an accredited IDVA and ISVA who built experience establishing a gender-responsive domestic abuse service. Luke is also a member of the Board of Trustees for a Sussex-based charity for offenders, a domestic violence perpetrator program facilitator, a restorative justice facilitator for sensitive and complex cases, and is a postgraduate forensic psychology student. And in whatever spare time he might have left at the end of all of that, is hyper-vigilant in the pursuit to keep his 3 young children as far from mischief as possible. So Luke, we are extremely pleased to have you with us today.
Thanks, Iona. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I can assure you the hardest part of all of that is keeping my 3 children out of trouble. So, yes, I am going to talk to you all today about the Drive project, a project now that's been sort of going since 2016. Got approximately 30 minutes to deliver this, and I do have a habit of going on. It's a subject that I'm quite passionate about, but I've been informed by Iona that she'll pop up and hurry me along, allowing for ample time for questions afterwards. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you along. I'm going to multitask, attempt it anyway. So I've got slides going here and some notes that I sort of may refer to. Just a little bit of a health warning as well. Whilst there are some anonymised victim survivor and service user statements that you'll sort of see later on, there are yet still on a more uplifting sort of note, but obviously we don't know sometimes what sort of material connects with us. So yeah, please do. There's sort of a function here to sort of reach out as well, as Iona has discussed. So yes, Drive. So let's get into this. Drive is a collaboration, as Iona sort of knows, between Respect. So Respect is a UK sort of membership organisation. So we hold the accredited standards, the safe and effective standards, if you like, of how we do this imperative piece of work, looking at the behaviour of those that basically they use abusive behaviours. So looking to targets for that behaviour. We also collaborate with social finance, who, if you like, are sort of the think tank and the imperative sort of linchpin that work alongside organisations like us and Safe Lives, will explain in a moment, but with UK government and the financial sector to be able to bring these ideas to life. Safe Lives, almost, if you like, the flip sort of organisation in the sector, working with victims and sort of survivors. So bringing together really, you know, some key agencies for this model. Now, the model that was, after a scoping exercise, the model for us that appeared to be the biggest gap in the system, and there are many when we're talking about addressing behaviours, abusive behaviours, was most certainly around high risk and high harm sort of clients. And by that, sort of what I mean is that we're talking here high risk of serious harm and homicide. And so we very much set up to meet that and to begin to work with individuals that were subjecting their partners to this level sort of abuse. And the terminology high harm for me is really important as well, because what we have more worked at doing sort of latterly as the project has matured is picking up you know, the individuals that potentially don't quite hit that high risk threshold but are still causing a significant level of harm. So it might be repeat sort of offending, but over a longer period in time. I don't like the term sort of low level, but we you know, we sort of see it kind of used. And so the lower level sort of abuses outside of that high risk category, I mean, over a long period of time, or an individual that might be offending time and time again with lots of different victims and survivors. Okay, so I've already sort of given that bit of opening sort of information. Our wider sort of networks. So the funding, I'm not going to go too sort of far into this, but as you can kind of see there, is via various different sort of funding streams. So we work with local police and crime commissioners, local authorities, National Lottery, Lloyds Bank Foundation, Comic Relief and Tudor Trust, to name but a few. It is a national project. We're in approximately 10 locations around the country at this point in time. And we employ, we don't employ, sorry, but as part of sort of commissioning bids for the service, we work with local delivery partners that bid to deliver this service, and some of these partners have been Hampton Trust, DVIP, Cranston, Safer Merthyr, the Change Project. There's sort of a number. So into sort of some more of the meat and bones. So what are we doing at Drive? What are our aims? Very simple. We want to reduce the number of repeat and new victims. We want to reduce the level of harm caused to victims and children. We want to reduce the number of serial perpetrators of domestic abuse. And we want to intervene earlier to protect families with domestic abuse. That's a really interesting sort of terminology, that intervening earlier, when you think, okay, it's high risk, you know, how can we be intervening sort of early with high risk? And I'll sort of go through to explain that on a couple of slides time. But this is just a bit of a infogram about where we sort of are in the country and the scope of the work. So to date, approximately, this number obviously is going up as the day and days go by. We've worked with over 1,600 people that are perpetrating domestic abuse. We've had approximately 1,800 victim survivors that have fallen under and had support by the programme, and that's in excess of 2,700 children as well. I should sort of add as well that we know, a bit of a dark figure, in the sense that the victim survivors sort of and children, these are what we know about. These are the victims and survivors that the systems are able to sort of collate you know, evidence for, and that sort of fall in the limelight sort of the systems. And what we have known, and this will come up sort of later as well on our project, you know, we have had perpetrators of domestic abuse having sort of 7 to 8 different victims, so quite significant numbers. So we know that there's bigger numbers out there on those last two, victims and survivors and children. But yes, you can see kind of locations we're in. I won't read those out at the moment. So the scale of the problem, I think, you know, we know the huge scale of the problem. It's sort of here in front of us. The big thing for me here is that fewer than 1% of perpetrators receiving specialist intervention that can prevent future abusive behaviours. That's preventing abusive behaviours now for victim, survivor, family, children, extended family, whoever's impacted by this humongous ripple effect that is so often had around domestic abuse. But also as well, this sort of idea of, you know, the victim survivors of tomorrow, the next sort of relationship, that idea of, you know, we need to be able to, and very much this is what this pilot is about, focus correctly where the issue is. You know, we so often sort of hear, by its very nature, it's a gendered crime, but domestic violence being a women's issue. I mean, for me, in my experience, it appears to be primarily men's issues when we're talking about, you know, heterosexual sort of abuse, very gendered, male perpetrator, female victim, and survivor. So absolutely. So when we look at this, under 1% receiving specialist intervention, we have a huge, huge problem here. We're not appropriately addressing the root cause of the problem. And interestingly, when we've worked with our colleagues at Safe Lives and we're having a look at, you know, focus groups, for example, and we're asking victim survivors, you know, what do you want? What do you want to happen? And often what we have is the idea of, well, actually, I just want the abuse to stop. I want it to end. And saying that actually, you know, 80% thinking that perpetrator interventions are a good idea, but only 2.5% saying actually that their partner went onto that program. And some statistics from Respect that kind of gives you the scale of the problem. And this is dating back in 2015, 2016, and it's not greatly improved sort of since then. But there's approximately 3,500 domestic violence perpetrator program spaces. So this domestic violence perpetrator program is a up to 30-week program. That's sort of the Respect standard, if you like, whereby the individual that's been using abusive behaviours will essentially go onto this course to have their values, belief systems, some of their motives, drivers for the abusive behaviours sort of challenged in an appropriate way that enables them basically to be able to connect with the material and go on this sort of journey of really looking at this behaviour. 3,500 spaces per annum in the UK. That's it. And when we look at the Office of National Statistics data around how many recorded incidents of domestic abuse there are, you know, that's a crime sort of in itself. So as a side to this, what we also do as well is very much lobby work with government. We've got sort of a piece out at the moment, the call to action, where we are looking to address this. We're not saying that drive is the only answer. It certainly isn't, but is an effective answer, which I hope I'll be able to demonstrate as this presentation sort of goes on. As you can see, the perpetrator is a problem. Why is it the victim is the one who has to move and seek refuge when the perpetrator carries on as normal? If we don't deal with them, then they just move on to the next victim. We have to at least try and change their mindsets. And, you know, if we think about sort of that, you know, everything we know about resilience, about recovery, is about being embedded, connected in your local community, connected with your support networks. And yet for, you know, a significant period of time, and there, of course, is you know, when it's imperative to move victim survivor and their family away, most certainly so. But I feel sometimes what we have fallen into is the default set point of separate and isolate, whip you know, mum, victim survivor and children out of the property. Obviously what we find is that then pulls all of these people away from friends, family, support network, systems, all these protective factors in the moment for most effective, you know, risk management, but also for their recovery sort of later on. So we're looking to change where the focus of this issue is. It's, in this sense, you know, the issue with male perpetrators primarily. Okay, so yeah, just a couple more sort of quotes here from victims and survivors lent from Ava. So perpetrators need to take responsibility for their behaviour and be held accountable. I feel like everyone was blaming me for not protecting the children from him. No one ever blamed him or made him answer for what he did. So we'll give sort of examples of where we are looking to overcome some of these significant systemic sort of issues. You'll hear me speaking quite a gendered nature. We do obviously recognise that, you know, from a sort of progressive standpoint, that anybody has the potential to use sort of abusive behaviours, but, you know, very much in the way that the research sort of trend shows us and the data, we, you know, primarily we are very much speaking in a gendered way, male violence to you know, female victims and survivors. But the project does work with all different variations, iterations of abuse dynamics. Yeah, I think I've sort of said plenty around that. So this is really interesting. This is from a colleague actually of mine that put this together really eloquently. You know, without this work, we know that domestic abuse perpetrators will continue to enter new relationships, create more victims, and expose more children to harmful behaviours. It is about ending abuse for the victims today, but also the victims of tomorrow. And, you know, we know, for example, that we have a very good IDVA provision And the IDVA response, the independent domestic violence response, works very well. So women that are high risk of domestic abuse and that are open and engaging with an IDVA service often will have much better outcomes in relation to safety and risk management. We know that sort of works. We also have sort of a bit of an old culture that I've sort of spoken about, where we have separated and isolated. And so what we have done is sort of remove mum, family sort of from the home and tried to create as much gap and as much distance between the two individuals as possible, which often is a challenging thing when we consider children, for example, because we may have, for example, within a plan, social care sort of advising, actually, we need to stop contact with dad. So mum, you need to stop contact with dad. But then default position, if that then does happen, in the next step to that is that family court, dad wants to exercise sort of access rights, if you like. The default position often of sort of the family court is that children's outcomes are better if they have access to both parents. So we sort of have the system at the beginning, if you like, sort of setting mum up, who's therefore then, not acting protectively if she goes against that, to then enter the family court arena and potentially to be viewed sort of negatively. We know victims, survivors, perpetrators, they're relational. They've had a history. That usually means they're potentially going to have a future in some shape or form, often in attempt to co-parent as best they can for the best outcomes for their children. And so just separating and isolating as this sort of old gold standard, as a sort of a blanket kind of policy, obviously we can see is inherently flawed. So, what we're doing is working in a very bespoke way, very much led by the victim survivor and what their wants are, and what their needs are, and using those wants and needs, informed obviously by our safe and sort of effective practice, to be able to work with these individuals to find sort of the better outcomes. But for us, it's absolutely, there are times we need to separate and isolate, but actually we want to move towards a culture, very much pinched from Emily Allison and Cheshire Without Abuse, is engage and intervene. So what we do sort of in detail, what you'll sort of see here is just a sort of a bit of narrative. So I'm just going to pull out some of the basics, I guess, and just make sure I've not missed anything. So we work up to 12 months with an individual that's using abusive behaviours, and often over. So if there's a good defensible decision making around, okay, we need to continue to work with this individual and place resource in, we most certainly will. Sometimes intervention could be somewhat shorter if it's required to sort of be short, if we believe, okay, evidence-based, the outcomes that we were looking to achieve for this victim survivors focused, actually those outcomes have been achieved. We're now back open to systems. For example, that's, they're back open to children's services. They're now appropriately seeing where the abusive behaviour is actually located within this situation. We're helping them to work in a more domestic abuse informed manner. There might be other supports in place around other needs that the clients may have, substance misuse, housing, you sort of name it. So the programme, unlike a domestic violence perpetrator programme, sort of 30 weeks, usually quite modularised. So each week you have a particular topic and you're in a room between 8 and 12 potentially other men. Very unlike that in the sense that we work in a bespoke manner. So we work in a risk and need sort of led response. So we are looking at what the individual's drivers, motivators, destabilizers, disinhibitors, all these things that can impact somebody's propensity, their ability to be abusive. We look to target them specifically. So we essentially can, and we have the luxury to be able to deep dive that little bit further, get a bit closer to understanding sort of that individual, their use of abusive behaviours, what function that abusive behaviour sort of serves, and any other things that can escalate that abusive behaviour, and look to provide sort of supports as well. So we are part of that coordinated community response. We're embedded within local communities. So we have wraparound support from all services, and also independent domestic violence advisor will be on hand and working with victim survivor, unlike usual IDVA provision, where you're often in service for a short amount of time and often due to capacity, very sadly, sometimes the longer term recovery work isn't necessarily sort of there. It can be quite focused work. What I'm trying to say here is that our, the service users that we are working with, their partners, victim survivors, will have the access to an IDVA, specialist domestic abuse support, for up to and beyond 12 months, however long that individual is open to the service for. The model, and I'm going to sort of apologise for this, but this is the best way to kind of give you a bit of an insight around, I guess, how the sort of model works. So we take our referrals from, if you like, high risk forums, and so safeguarding forums, either sort of police led or part of that coordinated community response. And then we have another sort of avenue then where these referrals are then taken through to a panel, which we then discuss. So we have a look at these cases and discuss how we are going to best dispose of, is sort of the wrong word, but like a disposal option. So if we're coming on to drive, the individual will be assigned this case manager. So the case manager will be the individual that stays with them throughout the duration of the program, that will be responsible for delivering their bespoke behavioural change work, which I'll speak about briefly in a moment. And also some of the disruption sort of tactics as well. So this case manager largely is this central point orchestrating the sort of response to this individual that's using abusive behaviours. The IDVA obviously works alongside the victim survivor, and also as well there is, and it's still a postcode lottery. We're working with our local partners in our local areas to see and work out how we can also provide therapeutic support for the children and young people that are associated with our perpetrators as well. So the case manager will then, after receiving this referral from the panel, do a bit of a deep dive on this individual. So obtain obviously as much information that they can. That then gives them a good picture of the individual and how then they can potentially begin to formulate sort of a plan to risk manage, to interrupt sort of the individual. But obviously, first and foremost, to work out whether actually contact with this individual is going to be safe and is the potential to be effective, which is very much led by this multi-agency information share, by our risk assessments, which is imperative then obviously when we bring in the victim survivor expert by experience. Often nobody knows the individual that we're obviously trying to work with better than a victim and survivor. So very much pulling in information and knowledge from them too via their domestic violence advocate. Now, and when we look at sort of what we're doing, and it's very basic, I guess, in my explanation here, but we are looking to employ tactics that minimize this individual's potential to be abusive. So often with our criminal justice partners, employing their sort of help and their assistance with that. And we're working sort of towards ways of getting closer to that individual. So if the individual's open to a certain practitioner or professional or system, maybe, you know, jumping on the back of that pre-existing good professional relationship for us to then begin to have that conversation with the individual and get that a little bit closer. What we often find, because our service partners are third sector sort of charities, if you like, all respect accredited or working towards respect accredited, so specialists in the line of work, if you like, but because we come from sort of that angle and we are not sort of statutory, which often we find a lot of the guys that we work with often have been open and around systems since they were very young, so can be, for example, very negative against children's services, adult social care, probation, sort of you name it. So we sit sort of in a bit of a unique position where we can authentically engage the individual, coming from sort of a point of view of accountability. But actually what we're going to do is we're going to look at this sort of with you. So yes, we look to sort of use those pre-existing relationships. What we often find as well, and we talk about the cohort of individuals that we often have referred to service, they do often have a lot of other additional need. And when I talk about needs, substance misuse, housing, mental health, they're all usually very prevalent across the caseload and in quite significant need of help and support. So a lot of the individuals we often work with, in relation to their readiness willingness to change or their ability to change need a level of sort of support, if you like, to begin with. So we look at that stabilisation piece as well, bring them a bit closer to services to get that specialist support around those other areas of need, whilst we then come along and do the specialist domestic abuse intervention. So very straightforward, just another sort of a version of the above. But and you can see there, victim survivor support running for the duration of that intervention, and children and young people's recovery services as well, running for the duration of that intervention. I just want to spend a little bit of time here talking about, I guess, the outcomes, because you know, this is what it's about. It's about outcomes, about better outcomes for victim survivors, for children, but also for the individuals, for the ones using abusive behaviours as well. Because what we want to see, obviously, is not just their behaviour sort of disrupted and that's it. We do, of course, we do. But what we really want is we want that behaviour moved on in a long-term, more meaningful sort of manner. And one sort of thing I like to kind of talk about. I'm going to try and sort of dig it out now, because I think it's an interesting sort of stat, because primarily often what we want to do is seek a punitive measure, and the punitive measures often are needed. You know, the criminal justice system is there for a reason, but we obviously have a significant issue with you know, attrition throughout the criminal justice system and getting prosecutions. And this is interesting because the College of Policing list this on their website. This piece of research is listed on their website by Garner and Maxwell in 2010, and I quote, "Criminal justice sanctions for intimate partner violence have no consistent effect on subsequent offending. Specifically, prison sentences were associated with higher rates of recidivism 36% of the time, and they had no effect on the remainder." So when we're sort of looking, even if we get to that point where we get a prosecution, you know, contemporary research is telling us that actually it has a limited sort of effect. So that big stick, as we know, isn't really working by itself. So we need to do something else. We need to really engage with the problem, the person, their values, their beliefs, their attitudes, and try and move that piece on, as well as that criminal justice piece, if that sort of needs to happen. But yes, some of the outcomes. So when we're looking at the closed cases, the University of Bristol, so they did an independent evaluation with a randomized controlled trial. So as far as gold standard goes, that's pretty much a gold standard in sort of academic literature. And so they looked at the 500 cases that had closed. So they've been open to drive since its inception in 2016 up to 2019. And what they found is the reduction of abuses, you know, as you can see there, 82%. Physical abuse, sexual abuse 88%, and sort of I can go on. So we're having significant movements here from these individuals using abuses to a high level and reducing sort of significantly. And what we kind of saw at the bottom there as well is that when we were asking the IDVAs for feedback too around, okay, so what's the risk looking like on this case that's open to both yourself and us drive? We work collaboratively on this, and they were reporting that, you know, risk had reduced in 82% of those cases that were open to drive compared to the control group. So the control group is the group that didn't have the drive, the model sort of associated as well. It just had the IDVA response. So really, really, really significant numbers. And one you can't see here, but I like to kind of bring as well, is that something around the added value of drive, because we know the IDVA response works. We know it works incredibly well, and it's so imperatively important. And what they kind of found about this added value is that the University of Bristol found that victims in drive were 3 times less likely to experience physical abuse than the control group that were having no drive intervention. So we know IDVA works, but this is just a little bit about, I guess, that added value of drive and what drive sort of brings to. We're coming towards the end now and expecting Iona to pop up very soon. We'll break into sort of questions, but you know, this is sort of very, very similar. I'm quite interested here on this right-hand side, the evidence of the impact, because there's some wider systems sort of work here as well. So what we did in the first one here around the merit cases, so the high-risk cases, we tracked them through the high-risk victims forum. And we found that the individuals that we were open to and we'd been working with, they were coming through that forum much more less. So we were making a statistically significant difference. And again, any sort of data to BOFs would sort of love this. This is sort of that mark whereby this is where you know you're making a difference. It's statistically significant. And we also there in the middle one here is looking at police data, we looked at police data 6 months prior to the intervention at Drive, during the entire intervention, and then 6 months after. We wanted to look longitudinal now, what's going on over a period of time. And what we found is that the individuals that were open to us Drive that we were working with, their offending had reduced by 30% compared to the group that were in the control group that didn't get the Drive intervention. So again, further added sort of value there. And lastly as well, what we have known a lot about our cohort, and there's different typologies of sort of perpetrators, loosely speaking, but there's one that sort of classes a bit more of an antisocial. So they have a criminal identity in their own right, and we get high numbers of those sort of individuals sometimes coming through Drive. So what I mean there is that they're often sometimes known for domestic abuse offending, but compared to their other offending, actually, you know, that sort of is relatively still unknown, the domestic abuse offending. There's other things in there, antisocial behaviour, other assaults to non-intimate partners, frauds, you name it. And what we found is actually that it had a significant positive impact on their other offending behaviour too, because they essentially have got this one individual that's assigned to them, whether they are engaging sort of willingly with us and really wanting to this change and this journey of change, or actually a bit sort of reluctant, paying lip service, but are sort of open to us, we are still sort of, if you like, having a positive impact on that individual's offending. So there's a significant impact there on the criminal justice system sort of at large, and other victims outside of intimate partner violence too. So just a couple of sort of quotes. I know it won't be too sort of long. I've overrun slightly, a couple more minutes, and I think I'll sort of be there. But just a couple of quotes here. You know, for the first time, someone's holding him to account. It's not just me. You know, I feel finally other people believe me when I tell them, you know, what the ex-partner is like. It's good that everyone's aware of his behaviour. Again, not just me. We know the most common sort of abuse and violence is psychological abuse. You know, we know coercive control. We're learning a lot about this now. How do we control someone? Physical violence gets you in the spot of bother. So if we use sort of, you know, psychological abuse to sort of control, that's very hard to sort of pick up. It's very hard to, you know, because it's hard to sort of track. So incredible there that actually what's coming out from this, victims' survivors are saying actually people are really understanding what this is, what was happening. And it wasn't just me. You know, it wasn't me just being crazy or whatever this individual was leading me to believe sort of I was. And a couple here from sort of service users, and it's this idea that you have asked me challenging questions which have given me a different perspective on my situation. I have taken responsibility for the way things are. Something here as well, I think, is interesting from our police colleagues. So we are very well linked sort of in with the police. And this is a Drive fellow, someone that looked at implementing Drive in our South Wales sites. We've got South Wales sort of wide pan coverage, if you like. The introduction of Drive in South Wales has been a real catalyst, a change in the way we approach domestic abuse. There has been a genuine sea change amongst police and partners away from asking, why doesn't she leave, to asking, why doesn't he stop? We have started to put much more focus on the perpetrator and told them to account for their behaviour, whilst at the same time ensuring that safeguarding and preventing and reducing future risk is everybody's focus. It is genuinely heartwarming to hear feedback from victim survivors about the positive impact the Drive is having on their life. Owner, very good timing. I'm going to leave that sort of up there for kind of others to have a look at the project. But yeah, please do obviously get in touch. Iona, how was that for timing?
Oh, that was pretty good for timing. I reckon 33 minutes. We've done pretty well. But we've also had 33 minutes and 33 votes for the first question.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good.
I know. So one of the ones that's come in and has had this 33 votes is whether you feel that there should be a register for DA perpetrators, similar to the sex offenders register.
Yes, that's something that is very interesting. And you forgive me, I'm not close to Drive sort of response on that. But if you're asking me, you know, as a professional, I could guess I can answer sort of in that capacity. I believe there needs to be something above and beyond what we currently have. If that is a register, and again, you're gonna have to forgive me because I'm not as close to the sort of sex offenders register and what that sort of means and how effective it is. I know there's a lot of controversy around the effectiveness of that system. So that's why I can't wholeheartedly say that a register is something that will truly be an effective sort of response and measure. But the one thing that I do know, and I do feel very, very strongly about, is that we need a whole system response to this. You know, I've come here today to talk about high risk and high harm. Something we've started getting involved in now is more of an earlier sort of intervention piece. So we've just set up a project in 10 London boroughs that have taken it up, where we're looking at more of this working with social care, that identifying earlier intervention cases where the abuse levels are, sorry, I don't like the term, but more lower sort of risk or not as matured in their complexity and dynamic. So we need a full system response to domestic abuse perpetrators, without a doubt.
I think one of the things that always makes me slightly anxious about that idea is that there's always all of these counter allegations, and actually registers are quite a blunt tool. And I suppose we do also have Clare's law as a sort of counterpart to it. Yeah,
absolutely. And you know, on to sort of counter allegations there, it is quite interesting. You know, we do start from the standpoint of acknowledging domestic abuse is a gendered crime. We're largely talking that, you know, males perpetrate against females, but we're not saying that's the only version of abuse that exists. We're certainly not. But we have processes sort of in place where we deep dive these cases where there are sort of counter allegations, where they are coming backwards and forwards, or actually systems have just got it wrong. You know, we've had a police officer attend address. We've had a victim survivor that is potentially what we would call, I guess, acting in terms of violence resistance, so has fought back or punched or hit, and so therefore the perpetrator has actually got the most significant injury. Now, the police officer likely was going to happen here because you're going to see remorse from a victim survivor and not so much from a perpetrator. The injury's there to back it up. You know who's going to get arrested for this one. And so we take these and we look at these and we actually say, okay, right there, if there's a few red flags here, which, as you know, us in sort of the sector are kind of trained to do, then we apply this framework of assessing these counter sort of allegations too. So yeah, for us as a project, we're very interested in those, because for us, yeah, it's significant. We are looking to become involved in some of those cases to obviously ensure that both parties get the most effective response.
So one of the other questions we've had from Katie, because we had a session yesterday that was looking at mutual and situational abuse.
Yes.
About the possibilities of using sort of couples counselling in that sort of situation, which can be really controversial. And we were talking then about that sort of the different typologies of violence. So you might have intimate terrorism, mutual and situational abuse, and you just
absolutely
spoke about violent resistance. So what are your thoughts about whether this can be safe and appropriate? And I suppose just to link another question to that, so we had Rachel talk about narcissistic and manipulative behaviours and whether there's capacity for change.
Yes.
Because that's one of the key things that Damien was talking about yesterday, was that they've got to be sort of committed to having this capacity to change and to living together in a safe way. And that commitment's got to be there.
Yes, absolutely. Start. So, yeah, good questions. I've pull me back to them, because one thing I think that maybe I didn't just being very mindful of the time come through, is that, you know, we don't need the one using abusive behaviours consent or awareness that we're working with them. We can still operate sort of behind the scenes, if you like, with our multi-agency partners to put in measures that reduce this individual's ability to sort of be abusive. And so we do work with an awful lot of individuals that, you know, largely aren't aware of our presence or aware that they're sort of open with us. So that's sort of quite an interesting piece that we you know, and I think with our guys too, and what's very different. So when you look at sex offender research, it's really interesting, and it's kind of loosely linked to the line of work that we do, because we feel that we need verbal acceptance and acknowledgement of what has happened and what has occurred. And for some reason, we feel that that is a good assessment for treatment, and also it's predictive of an outcome that's lower reoffending outcomes. It's not. All the sex offender research tells us that accountability and saying, yeah, I did it, etc., is not positively correlated to lower rates of reoffending after the program. And so for us, we look to work with the individual where they are, and we acknowledge that their resistance to whatever they've got, the internal conflicts around the horrible things that they are often committing, you know, for us, we'll work with them where they are, where it's safe and where we feel we can be effective. We'll begin that work, because otherwise, you know, if we say that domestic abuse is an issue with value and belief systems, and the majority of individuals perpetrating abusive behaviours don't sort of realise it's their problem. So that's where we're sometimes starting with, is we're picking up these guys that are sort of, you know, like here on their recovery journey, and having to bring them to a point of, oh, actually, yeah, this is sort of my problem. Couples counselling, yeah, it is really controversial. I think, you know, you have inherently, if we understand domestic abuse as somebody that wants power and control over another person, that's at its basic level. I do another piece of work because I'm quite interested in asking, okay, fine, I accept that power and control is what this individual wants, but why? And I guess a more straightforward, easy understand answer is just to say all domestic abuse perpetrators are just raging narcissists, which is factually incorrect. Domestic abuse perpetrators, if we're saying, you know, 1 in 4 women in their lifetime will experience abuse, you do the maths and scale that up to how many raging narcissists we've got walking around in this country. We may have a significant number, but anyway, I think for me, it's much more progressive to start from the standpoint of everybody has the capacity to be abusive. You know, we look at adverse childhood experiences. We're learning more now about violence in the home, what that means for young children. So young boys, I've forgotten the sort of quote, I wrote it down in my papers, I'll try and dig it out at the end. But we're saying young boys that survive family violence are 3 to 10 times more likely to be abusive as adults. You know, so we're starting now. We're not using this as an excuse, but we need to understand the reason why power and control is needed in intimate relationships and how that functions. So and it can be correct. There are narcissistic behaviors. We see them in the perpetrators, but that doesn't mean that they are just, you know, just narcissists. They're very diverse in who they are, the reasons why they abuse, the motivations, drivers, all those different types of things. So, you know, for us, I guess we're really interested in taking a more comprehensive look at the reasons to why this power and control is needed. So if you've got that power and control in a relationship, that's going to extend to the therapy route, you know. And therapy is a really challenging thing. And I'm not saying that it doesn't have its place, because I do believe in certain dynamics, in certain relationships, it can. But I think largely, especially when you're looking at our cohort, it certainly isn't what we would be considering safe and effective as a blanket policy, certainly.
And I think that's exactly echoed by Damien yesterday, is, you know, he spent quite a long time sitting on Mareks. I think he said about 10 years on a Marek. And he said it was, you know, a vast minority that it would have been suitable for, but where the people are suitable, it can work really well. So just, and I think probably having that sort of breadth of different responses is possibly what's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, certainly so.
So we've got Kate. So do you feel that perpetrator behaviour can actually be changed? In my experience, speaking to victims, the programs have not helped, and they feel they have gained more information about ways to abuse.
Yeah, and I think it's good, and I think we're, you know, hopefully more progressive in the sector to kind of acknowledge this. Absolutely, there most certainly is always a risk of this sort of happening and occurring. You know, some of the biggest signifiers for change is, as your colleague sort of mentioned the other day, they've got to want it. You know, they have to want it, and this is for any change on anything. And that change takes place in a relational fashion. We're relational beings. And so if you're just going to hit someone with a stick and put them in prison and hope that that's going to fix the problem, it might for a certain amount of time. In our experience, what we find is they just continue to abuse inside prison. And that's why we work with individuals that are in prison too. And we work with the systems they're in to stop that from occurring inside sort of prison. So often what we find is some of these behaviors for some of the individuals, you know, these are scripts about who they are in the world, about what relationships are, about what women are. And they are challenging to address. These are long-standing things. And so sometimes what we kind of think is, okay, so a 30-week program sounds sort of quite comprehensive. We've got some good data to say that it is safe and it is sort of effective. But, you know, if you're being really critical to that, taking apart someone's values and belief systems, their inability to emotionally regulate, their sense of entitlement and ownership over somebody, whether that's because they have more narcissistic sort of tendencies or actually because they're really attachment disordered, in that they can't tolerate a potential separation and a loss from the other person, because there might be things around their self-identity that are sort of potentially, you know, insecure, for example. So they can't, whatever way you look at sort of this thing, it's really challenging. But the data sort of sets kind of show us. So what I'd signpost you to, and it's a brilliant question, this one, as are the others, but this is particularly a challenging one. So have a look at our website, the Drive website, and what you'll find on there for the avid readers, you've got 3 years worth of independent evaluations, University of Bristol, that have looked at what we are doing in qualitative. So they've interviewed service users, victims, survivors, professionals. They've looked at the systems they operate in, and they've also crunched the data, the quantitative data as well. So look at those outcomes, and you've got the exec summaries for people that want to look at them quickly. And then Respect also have commissioned their own piece back in 2015, and the university that collaborated on that, I forget. The one thing I do like about that piece is that the outcomes weren't just some academic sitting in an ivory tower saying, this is what I want to show that this program works. They consulted victim survivors, and victim survivors told them what they wanted. And, you know, some of these things around like space for action, you know, are really important. To be able to choose what cereal the children can have, to be able to wear whatever earrings or outfit, to be able to collaborate, a parent in a collaborative sort of sense and fashion. So, you know, I would love to say that every single person is going to change. You know, they're not. A lot of things have got to align. A lot of accountability has got to add. There's got to be an intensity around the work for us, and a sensitive way of doing it. And I often sort of relate this in the sense that abusive behaviours, you know, we still as men, and men's culture, as a real man doesn't hit a woman. Obviously, a real man also doesn't need to overtly control a woman as well. You know, that doesn't. So we've got this kind of conflict sort of in that sort of sense. So that the behaviour, what is shameful, there's social sanctions for it amongst peers, and there's criminal justice sort of sanctions to it. The behaviour brings about a level of shame, and I sometimes do sort of this exercise with professionals, other people, is, you know, to sort of demonstrate sometimes how we've got to kind of do elements of the work too, and how the stick doesn't work. Because if, for example, I invite people on this call now to think about a time where they've behaved, so it sounds like apologies, I don't know if you can hear that, it sounds like my next door neighbours found a great time to put a drill straight through the wall. If we think about an occasion where you behaved in a manner you're ashamed of, and you hold that, you know, what is that thing, and what's that bringing up for you? Physiologically, your heart will start going, you'll get a bit anxious, nervous. If I then had to say, you know, Ina, share it with me, tell me.
Yeah, no, I'd absolutely feel sick.
You got it. Because, yeah, you know, so what do you need from me? You know, so I could enable you to connect with that thing as truthfully, as authentically as you possibly could, to tell me the ins and outs of your behavior, the full levels of responsibility. You know, you need compassion, you need openness, you need me not to shame you further. This isn't colluding with you for what you did. I can still say that, you know, that what you did wasn't okay. What you did caused X, Y, and Z. But actually, rather than shaming you or doing whatever, I'm allowing you an opportunity to really connect with a thing and stop denying it and make this thing real and address it and bring it out to the cold light of day and work on it. And then also then this other systems become aware. So actually now child protection systems now know the behaviours, the root causes of the behaviours, because I can feed that information to them. You know, we can work sort of collaboratively. So there's so much, I guess what the picture I'm trying to paint here, sorry, I think it was a question from Kate, I do have a habit of going on, is that there's so much potential benefit from the work, so much. So whilst I would love to say behaviour change is guaranteed for every single sort of individual, you know, it is for a good number. The data sort of represents that, but also as well, we know there's a multitude of benefit coming from moving the actual problem on.
So a question from Danielle, because you touched on family court, and she wants to know about the statistics of perpetrators attending the course during family court hearings and then dropping out once contact's in place. Yeah,
that's a good question, a brilliant question, and I'm going to have to disappoint you. I honestly, you know, don't know, and you know, it's a very good question because I know that system is very often used incorrectly. Evan Stark, who talks about coercive control, uses this term of children become weaponized. And then we see systems just further abused, create the same dynamics that they've been subject to in the relationship, you know, and that isn't okay. And that's other bits and pieces that we're looking to do. So we sort of have this piece around delivery that we do, but also this piece that we do, I guess, around loose sort of lobbying and looking at the big and wider systems. And so there's sort of a piece at the minute, I think I referenced it within the presentation, sort of a call to action where we look to sort of address some of these issues. You know, some of the things that we do on a local level. So something I've just designed actually and implemented in London is this early intervention piece. And I always pull this out. So it's from a joint area inspection 2017, where basically 6 local boroughs were looked at around their practice. You know, what's their safeguarding child protection practice and working sort of with perpetrators. And they found, I'll find it in a moment, but essentially one of them was holding mum inappropriately to account as the only means to safeguard the children. So basically telling mum, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do the other. Because if dad just disappears, dad's nowhere near. And obviously the child protection sort of service, you know, obviously their outcome is for child protection outcomes for minors. Absolutely. You know, that's, but what sometimes sort of what we see is therefore don't allow dad in, written on a plan, stop contact. Okay, realistically, who protects mum if dad's bashing the door in at 2 in the morning? Because even on the best response sort of going, that's still 10, 15 minutes of a father kicking down a door, and a lot of trauma children are going through. So, you know, and what we sometimes then see, obviously, is mum trying to placate and allowing dad into the address. And then we get child protection services later on sort of say, well, you're not acting protectively, you're not following this plan. We're going to up the risk on this plan. We're going to start putting these other measures in. In the meantime, that's
where do these, you know, because that is actually, you know, letting someone in the middle of the night is good safety planning. You
Absolutely.
Know, what is your alternative?
Absolutely.
It's trying to unpick that with other professionals, isn't it? About what would you have her do, and what do you think the perpetrator's response is going to be in that situation?
Absolutely.
You know, when it's all about power and control, and all of a sudden you've gone, no, you can't come in.
What do you think is going to happen, even in that moment or later on somewhere down the line? There's going to be consequences. There has to be, because that's how the sort of the cognitions it works. And so what we've done what we do in all of our sites nationally, but especially this one, we're collaborating, and Children's Services have been, you know, wonderful and really keen to be in partnership with us, is to work in this, what we would call domestic abuse informed manner. So we're working with these social workers on these early intervention cases and sort of, you know, collaborating and inviting them to have a look at the dynamics in a deeper sort of level. And, you know, the outcomes, it's early days. We're finishing this sort of, it's called an action research project in mid-February. But you know, the potential outcomes at the moment are promising. So we're moving away from this, you know, separate and isolate, you know, as a system. It's not just child protection, and my point of it's come across that we're just sort of bashing child protection here, but, you know, we see a lot of professionals doing it. You know, I don't know, I have to review a lot of, you know, risk assessments sort of sent in by the police, single blind risk assessment forms, and you'll often see wrote on there, risk lowered, suspect arrested. No. It might be lowered in that moment, but, you know, we've got to sort of, I guess, start working in a way that's more informed, victim survivor sort of centric. I guess, yeah, there's work to be done, you know, and we're doing our sort of bit, but we're always pleased to do more. But yeah, sorry, good question. Apologies, I don't have the statistics, but I know the issue very well.
What is the most common age range for perpetrators that you work with?
Oh, I should sort of know that one.
I mean, we don't really expect you to have all the numbers that.
So that will be on the University of Bristol executive of sort of evaluation. You know, what we often sort of see is, you know, that kind of age group of, you know, sort of 19, 20 up to sort of mid-30s. It's quite a big cohort of the individuals we work with. The oldest individual, I think, has been 83. And the youngest has been, I think, 16. So we don't just do intimate partner violence, we also do intrafamilial violence as well. So, you know, child to parent, for example, or any other kind of versions of. So
that seems to mirror the sort of the numbers that you get in either services as well, where you have the highest chunk in that sort of age ranges.
Absolutely.
What red flags can we be on the lookout for to identify perpetrators or potential perpetrators? And if we're worried about someone's behaviour, what's the first steps to constructively opening up a conversation with them?
There's a lot of variables in this one about opening up the conversation, so I can't necessarily give you an exact example that will fit, but hopefully some helpful terms. So Respect runs a national helpline for those that are concerned about using, you know, their use of behaviours in relationships is confidential, and also family members can call that for advice and guidance of as well. That if professionals are sort of out there here as well, we also host a web chat too for professionals that's open certain times of the week. You can find access to that via our Drive website. Red flags, I do some sort of bits and pieces around, identifiers of kind of coercive control. And if we're thinking that, a lot of abusive behaviours manifest from belief systems about the world and about women and about men's entitlement over certain kind of things. So some of the red flags that we often see in new relationships is that bit at the beginning occurring very, very fast. Very, very, very fast. So the periods of maybe moving in, the I love yous, all this, that, and the other. And you think, we're told this is romantic in the movies. Also in Disney, have been saying for 60 odd years that if you continue to basically chase down a female, you'll eventually get in. Because basically,
yeah, absolutely, stand outside the window and throw rocks. That's lovely.
Yeah, absolutely. It's what every woman wants, isn't it? It's just incredible. So that period being very, very, very fast. And I think this, this idea we look at coercive control about. So when does the beginning of a new relationship sort of start to turn into one that you're worried about? And I think for me, it's that idea of consequences. For example, we've all sulked. I know I've sulked. No doubt you've probably sulked to get some need of some kind sort of met. It's very kind of functional. But what we often kind of see after those periods in sort of relationships that are non-abusive is that you come back together again, you see each other, you meet somewhere in the middle, you apologise, the person, etc., and it's sort of resolved. What we tend to find in abusive behaviours, there's often consequences and therefore rules. So I've asked, I'm going to come and pick my partner up after she's been on a night out in town. I'm going to we're going to have some food on the way back and stuff like that. She arrives late. What I may do then is I may basically make that her fault because she's late. No, I told you this time, this time you had to sort of be there. You've broken that. You're now untrustworthy. And also the big thing here, you're responsible for how I feel. I've made you respond, that's it. So the location of blame is sort of already there. And now sometimes we mold and we go for an easier life. We might adjust our behavior sort of a little bit in there. But again, it's often you'll find that behavior adjust a lot and continue to adjust a lot. And this individual to be sort of on their terms. So there's a few sort of red flags, if you like, at the beginning of abusive relationships. Often you find how a prospective partner, in the age of sort of dating now online, I guess, is that how they talk about their previous partner, I'm also very interested in. This sort of idea that she was just a so-and-so, you're so different, I can't, placing you on this massive pedestal in comparison to the other. Of course, it's difficult because the other person may have exhibited behaviors that aren't very nice, but we often find that sort of 2.0. This other person's really demonized, and all of a sudden you as this new partner is this angel, this angelic figure who can do no wrong. That often sometimes can be a red flag.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've got the one on the Phoenix program this afternoon, which is a victims psychoeducational program, and we'll look at the warning signs in that, and actually from both sides, very, very similar. Yeah. So in your experience, what proportion of perpetrators are using coercive and controlling behaviour in their relationships? Yeah,
that's a very interesting one. There is a school of thought, and it's becoming more and more dominant, that all, at the heart of all domestically abusive relationship is coercive control, is some form of you trying to exert your will over the other person to get them to do something for you, whether that's coming from a point that you're a little bit narcissistic, so you expect sex at this time of the week, you expect this need met, you expect this role, this stereotypical outdated role of what a woman is, you sort of expect that. Or it's coming from this point of actually there's attachment sort of disorders or things sort of like that. We work with an awful lot of people that you would say have or experience like cluster B personality disorder pathways. So very attachment disordered, very emotionally dysregulated, and can be sort of quite impulsive. Which, essentially by themselves isn't necessarily markers for abusive behaviours in relationships. I'm not saying that, but we find those that use abusive behaviours also have that as a sort of mental health diagnosis and a backdrop. For us, when it gets to the higher risk, the extreme vast majority are exercising power and control in their relationships. And whether they are conscious of that, that's up for discussion. A high number will be conscious of their behaviours, and another number will be more unconscious of some of those behaviours or unaware of some of those behaviours. And that's where our job comes in, really, to bring that darkness into the light and open that up for that sort of individual and place them in that space of sensitively, carefully, but internal conflict. one of the biggest motivators for change for men is often when they're faced with loss. That's usually a risk escalation, as we know as well. Loss of status, title, relationship, children, you name it. But that's a big mobilizer for men, and all the research will tell you that. The problem is, what we find is men tend to go to GPs and will say, I've got depression, anxiety, my relationship's rubbish. And so we're obviously, you're going to know much more about this than sort of me, but some of the packages we've got around Iris, for example, where we're working with practitioners, general practitioners, to upskill their knowledge around domestic abuse, to find these signs, to be able to then, rather than refer to these men maybe for anger management courses, maybe put them on something around their depression, it will help. That's really prevalent in our cohort. General anxiety disorder, it will certainly assist. But that being it, because an anger management program is a completely different thing from a domestic abuse informed program.
Yeah, because the domestic abuse and coercive controlling behaviour is not about anger, really.
Completely. Yeah. Completely.
So I think that follows on really nicely for Mary's question, is whether you could outline what the drive interventions with the perpetrator look like, and what you do to address offending behaviour, and how do you affect this behaviour change?
That's a very good question. So a couple of examples. So we work often in a custodial setting with some of our individuals, especially if they're in a Majesty's prison for a certain amount of time, maybe under 3 years. That's a useful time for us to sometimes engage. They are, after all, pardon the pun, but a captive audience. So they're sort of easy to engage with. What we tend to find, obviously, domestic abuse doesn't stop just because this individual has gone into custody. They will find other ways to be able to do so. So we have sometimes, this sense of, because, what we want sometimes as society is an eye for an eye. That's what our criminal justice system is essentially based on, this sort of just desserts. So we've taken that eye for an eye. If we're extremely fortunate, our victim survivor potentially has a sense of closure, to then find they get X amount of communications landing through their door from this individual, or they're getting somebody else to continue the abuse, or to stalk, or to sort of harass. And obviously that becomes very difficult for the stat services to be able to deal with that sometimes effectively. So here we come along now and work with certain units within prisons, and start to look at this communication and say, this communication is happening, it's occurring, we need it ceased because this order's in place, that order's in place, or what have you. So that's sort of a way where we can disrupt some of the behaviour from the abuse for somebody that's in prison. What we do a lot of work around, obviously, with the individual when we get to them, is stabilisation. A lot of our individuals are subject to a lot of other additional needs. So to be able to effectively do the work, we can do that side by side, but we need to stabilise them. So we'll often try and stabilise whatever else is going on for them, so then we can do the domestic abuse informed work. And so, a lot of our work is based around respect sort of accredited work, but it's often psychoeducational sort of in nature. So understanding what is abusive behaviours, understanding the function of abusive behaviours, understanding why they're sort of using abusive behaviours, and then how not to sort of use those behaviours, and putting tactics in place, which therefore they can use as a basically a substitute for the abusive behaviours. And then the idea of working with the victim survivor via the IDVA throughout the whole time is that we are constantly checking in to seeing how these are playing out. Are they being used, abused? Are they paying lip service? When these men are doing that, we know, we're aware, so then we're able to invoke other sort of tactics for disruption.
Brilliant. So I think I'm going to do a final 3 questions, and I think I'll just go on some sort of general themes that we've had coming up. And so the first one would be around working with young people and children. And I think you said the youngest person that you'd worked with in Drive was 16. Is there any sort of complementary children's work that's being developed, or anything sort of in that sort of youth sphere?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what we're doing for those, in respect, they do and sort of hold some of the work around child to parent violence. So where we are working on cases where that is occurring, that is happening, we have the expertise that we can lend upon to be able to deal with that case responsibly. Now, I guess when we're looking at developmental trauma, let's face it, domestic abuse, you know, you are potentially in a situation there where you're being subjected to developmental trauma. You know, we are working to kind of meet that need. And so we've had in locations throughout the country, as part of often the IDVA service as well, where we've been able to commission children and young people's therapeutic support too. So that whilst mum is open to service, children can continue to access their own, you know, therapeutic space where some of their recovery, some of their safe space, their journey can begin as well.
So you've got a whole family that's able to access support. The
idea is absolutely no longer working in this kind of siloed and largely, you know, just pushing dad sort of out. There's a time and a space for that, but working this whole family approach doesn't mean the whole family, keeping the family together, but realizing that these men are dads and there will continue to be dads. And so therefore, actually, we need to continue to maintain a space close to dad so we can impact positive change, better risk assess, better risk manage, all these sort of different things.
Brilliant. Thank you. So one of the other ones it's quite interesting is a question from Laura about your thoughts about when severely victims who've experienced really severe abuse are continuing to protect perpetrators and maybe making excuses and those sort of reasons, and how the sort of work with the IDVA and the drive practitioner are working when you're sort of managing that dynamic.
Yeah, it's a really challenging one. I think we are very adept at being aware of, you know, coercive control and the impact of what I guess is not yet recognised in mental health literature. So we have like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that lists all the diagnoses for mental health sort of conditions. But we would sort of form some of that potentially under complex post-traumatic stress disorder if we just dropped sort of disorder off, if you like, because that sort of medicalizes the thing. But, you know, this being a really complex sort of facet, and this whole idea of, you know, we are hardwired to protect our attachment. That we are all attachment driven individuals, whether that be abusive one sort of or not. And, you know, we see, you know, certain things happen like, you know, Stockholm syndrome, you know, very much come from this idea that you'll capture this, the captor, sorry, this person in complete control of you, that's abused you, that's this, that, and the other. When you get an opportunity to be set free, you don't, because this individual's met a level of omnipotence. They're, you know, whatever your belief system is, but God, in that sense, they're always going to get you, they're always going to find you. They're the ones who control it. They're untouchable. You know, they're Teflon sort of thing. So it's a very challenging sort of piece of work, and where we feel there's a need for therapeutic sort of support alongside that is offered. You know, this is a consent-based service. You know, we are at times behind the scenes doing unto people. You know, especially if crimes have been committed, we're working with criminal justice partners to cease them and to bring about a sense of justice and disruption. But yes, that's a really challenging piece of work. We have the awareness of the issues, and we have tools sort of in place to be able to offer invitations for that individual to engage with us. And it's about us being as flexible. You know, it's not, we don't get this purpose that, oh, she won't engage. That doesn't come into our narrative. If someone's resisting you or not engaging with you, you as a practitioner, you need to change. That's what you're paid to do. That's what all your training's about. You know, you don't just then say, oh, this person's in denial, it's the perpetrator, or, you know, the victims of Oasis, oh, she's in denial, she's protecting me. It's like, well, no, we need to understand why. And then we need to find out the reasons why. Are there hooks? Are there levers for engagement? And how do we do that? So how do we set this arena that enables this victim survivor for her specific nuanced case to be able to engage with us as best she possibly can? And at times we've sort of put interventions into place that have enabled sort of that covertly to happen, where we've brought about a level of separation from the two and been able to get sort of, you know, access to victim survivor. And we've collaborated sort of on those interventions and look to sort of, yeah, create a bit of space for action for her.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question is basically been doing this fantastic presentation to a whole lot of professionals in Kent that are now really jazzed up about drive, want to get involved. Like, how can we refer? What's going on? And obviously in that map earlier, drive is not on the map.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are the options for people that are looking for something similar?
I would be getting off this call right now, find out who your local commissioners are, and sending them all mine or Drive's or our director, moreover, is the best place for it. Kyla Kirkpatrick's details, because we would love to be in Kent. And we would love to be in every single county. I'm a Kent boy, born and bred. I've not lived there for a while now, but I would especially love to see this intervention back in my home county. So have a look at our sort of literature online, have a look at sort of what we do. Please come through to either the Drive web chat or the Respect line, and you will get information, advice and guidance on where you can go as professionals, what is out there. So please just get in contact with us. I mean, first port of call, do come through to Respect, and you'll find a for professionals sort of section on the main sort of header of their page, but also you'll find a very similar layout on the Drive website as well.
Brilliant. I'm sure Rachel will be absolutely thrilled with that answer. But thank you so much for that. Thank you for spending an extra 10 minutes with us as well.
My pleasure.
It was absolutely fantastic, and I'm sure it's going to be something we're all going to go away and think about. And thank you to everyone that's asked a question, because I think those questions do really help us keep this conversation going, and we can learn an awful lot through these questions. And there is going to be a recording of this webinar that's going to be made available to you shortly. And remember, if you've enjoyed this event, there are still a couple of events left for the 16 days of action, and you can register for those on the website. So that's daeverybodiesbusiness.org. We can keep the conversation going with the hashtags DAEverybodiesBusiness and NoCSpeakOut. And just to remember, if today's talk has raised anything with you personally and you'd like to find out more about the services available to you, you can go to domesticabuseservices.org.uk, which is Kent's domestic abuse website, where you can find out about the local services. But thank you so much, Luke, because that really was brilliant.
No problems. It's my absolute pleasure. And thank you for all coming along today. Thanks for the opportunity. Goodbye.